The cabin of the packed flight from Denver to New York buzzed with the smug confidence of business class. Emma Carter, in her faded denim jacket and scuffed boots, navigated the narrow aisle, her steps deliberate, her worn backpack slung over one shoulder. The luxury carry-ons gleamed like trophies, their owners casting quick, dismissive glances her way. A woman in a tailored suit, her pearl earrings catching the cabin light, smirked as Emma passed. A man in a crisp navy blazer, his cufflinks flashing, leaned toward his seatmate and muttered, "Looks like she wandered in from a thrift store." His voice carried just enough for Emma to hear, but she didn't flinch. Her dark eyes stayed fixed on the seat numbers, her face unreadable. She wasn't here to prove anything, she just needed to get to New York. Sliding into 14C, a window seat, Emma tucked her backpack under the seat in front. The bag was old, patched with a faded insignia from a place she hadn't seen in years. The guy next to her, mid-40s with a watch that screamed wealth, gave her a quick once-over before returning to his laptop. His name tag read Thomas Reed, and his cologne was sharp enough to sting. Emma ignored him, her hands steady as she adjusted her seatbelt. She looked younger than her years, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun. No makeup, no pretense. To the cabin, she was just a nobody who'd scored a cheap ticket. But Emma's file, locked in some classified vault, told a different story, one of covert missions, a discharge shrouded in secrecy, and a call sign that carried weight in circles these passengers couldn't imagine. The plane hadn't even taxied when the first jab landed. Sarah Mitchell, the lead flight attendant, stood at the front of the cabin, her uniform pristine, her smile sharp as a blade. She'd sized Emma up the moment she scanned her boarding pass. "Economy's in the back, but we're full today, so you'll have to make do here," she said, her voice dripping with faint disdain. A few business class passengers chuckled. Thomas Reed leaned toward his seatmate, a guy in a silk tie named Daniel Pierce. "Probably one of those last-minute budget tickets," he said, loud enough for Emma to hear. She didn't react, just unzipped her backpack slowly, like she was counting her breaths. A woman across the aisle, her nails painted a glossy crimson, snickered. Emma's hands stayed steady, her focus on the window where the Denver tarmac stretched out under a gray November sky. It was November 12th, 2025, and the plane climbed into the clouds, the hum of the engines settling into a steady drone. Emma's hands rested in her lap, calloused from years of gripping controls in cockpits most of these people would never see. The woman with the crimson nails, Lauren Hayes, leaned toward her friend, a blonde in a cashmere sweater named Claire Evans. "Bet she's nervous sitting by the emergency exit," Lauren said, her smirk sharp. Emma's lips twitched into a faint smile, but she didn't turn. She unscrewed her water bottle with a slow twist, her eyes on the horizon like she was scanning for something no one else could spot. Claire's laugh cut through the cabin, sharp and practiced. Emma stayed silent, her grip on the bottle tightening just enough to crease the plastic. During the meal service, Sarah paused by Emma's row, holding a tray of business-class menus. She glanced at Emma's jacket, then handed a menu to Thomas with a warm smile. "Sorry, we only have enough for our premium passengers," she said, her voice carrying a smug edge. A man 2 rows ahead, in a tailored coat, turned back with a low chuckle. "She's probably fine with a burger," he said, his tone dripping with amusement. The cabin rippled with laughter. Emma's hand stilled on her bottle, her eyes meeting Sarah's for a split second. "Water's fine," she said, her voice soft but firm, like a line drawn in the sand. Sarah blinked, caught off guard, then moved on, her heels clicking faster. Emma leaned back, her fingers tapping once against the armrest, a small, controlled motion. Hours passed, the cabin settling into a rhythm of clinking glasses and self-assured chatter. Thomas kept glancing at Emma, his eyes narrowing like he was trying to place her. Finally, he spoke, his voice thick with condescension. "Headed to a job interview? Hope you've got something better to wear in that bag." Emma turned just enough to meet his gaze. "I'm good," she said, her voice low and steady, like a blade sliding into place. Thomas muttered something about kids these days and went back to his laptop. Emma's fingers brushed her seatbelt, adjusting it slightly, her face unreadable. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Folks, we're making a brief stop at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for refueling." Emma's head lifted slightly, her eyes sharpening as she glanced out at the military tarmac coming into view. Jets lined the runway, their sleek shapes glinting under the sun. Her fingers tightened around her water bottle for a moment before she set it down. Sarah, standing nearby, noticed the shift in Emma's posture. "Something catch your eye?" she asked, her tone more suspicious than curious. Emma didn't answer, just kept looking out, her hand still in her lap, like she was seeing something no one else could. As the plane descended, a businessman in a crisp gray suit, Michael Grant, stood to grab his bag from the overhead bin. He glanced at Emma and spoke loudly to no one in particular. "Some people don't know their place, do they?" A few passengers nodded, their smiles tight. Emma's eyes flicked to him for a moment before returning to the window. "I know where I am," she said, her voice so quiet it barely reached him, but its weight made him pause. He cleared his throat and sat down without another word. The cabin grew quieter, the air thick with tension. A man in business class, John Baxter, leaned over his seat, his tie loose, his grin mean. "What? You think you can fly a plane?" he said, his laugh sharp. Emma turned slowly, her eyes locking onto his. "I've been around planes before," she said, her voice calm but firm, like a door clicking shut. John's grin faltered, and he shifted, suddenly interested in his drink. When the plane touched down at Wright-Patterson, Sarah's voice came over the intercom. "A few select passengers have been invited to meet the F-35 pilots on the tarmac. Please remain seated unless notified." Her glance at Emma made it clear who wasn't invited. Emma didn't move, just sipped her water, her face blank. Lauren leaned toward Claire, her voice carrying. "They probably don't want photos with someone dressed like that." Claire nodded, her lips curling. Emma screwed the cap back on her bottle, her movements deliberate, like she was measuring the moment. A woman in a designer trench coat, Elizabeth Ward, paused by Emma's row, speaking to Sarah in a stage whisper. "You'd think they'd screen people better for flights like this." Sarah nodded, handing her a complimentary drink. Emma's fingers brushed a faded patch on her backpack, an eagle, sewn on years ago after a mission that left her hands shaking but her team alive. She looked up, meeting Elizabeth's eyes. "Screening's not my problem," she said, her voice low and even. Elizabeth froze, then hurried back to her seat. Emma's fingers tapped the armrest once, a quiet, controlled motion. Major Ethan Brooks stepped into the cabin, his uniform crisp, his presence commanding. He was in his late 30s, with eyes that missed nothing. He greeted the invited passengers with a nod, shaking hands with Thomas and Lauren. But then his gaze landed on Emma in 14C. He froze, his hand still gripping the last handshake. The cabin didn't notice at first, but Emma did. She met his gaze, her expression steady. "Are you Night Raven?" he asked, his voice low, almost reverent. Emma gave a small nod. Thomas snorted, like it was a joke. Brooks' jaw tightened. "My apologies for having you sit here," he said, louder now, for the whole cabin to hear. "You're invited to the tarmac immediately." Emma stood, slinging her backpack over one shoulder, her movements smooth and precise. The cabin buzzed with whispers, but she didn't look back. As she followed Brooks toward the exit, Michael Grant leaned out. "This has to be a mistake," he said, his voice confident. "She doesn't look like anyone important." Emma's hand tightened on her backpack strap, her knuckles whitening. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting his. "Looks can be deceiving," she said, her voice soft but sharp, like a blade cutting through silk. Michael's mouth opened, then closed, and he sat back, deflated. Brooks led her out, his glance at Michael a silent warning. On the tarmac, the air was sharp with jet fuel and wind. The F-35 pilots stood in a line, their uniforms crisp, their faces unreadable. Brooks' voice cut through the silence. "Attention. This is Night Raven, who led 3 squadrons through enemy skies." The pilots snapped to attention, saluting in perfect unison. Emma returned the salute, her movements crisp, a faint smile tugging at her lips. The cabin windows filled with faces watching, their smugness replaced by shock. Emma's eyes flicked to the jets, her shoulders softening like she was home. Back on the plane, Thomas scoffed. "Sounds like a PR stunt," he said, his voice carrying. Sarah forced a chuckle. "Maybe it's just an honorary title," she said, smoothing her uniform. Claire whispered to Lauren, "No way it's real." Emma didn't look at them. She stood by the window, her hands in her pockets, watching the jets gleam. Brooks handed her an old flight helmet, the call sign Night Raven embroidered across it. "This is only awarded to pilots who've completed top-secret missions," he said, loud enough for the cabin to hear. Emma took it, her fingers tracing the stitching, then slipped it on. It fit perfectly, like it was made for her. A young pilot, barely in his 20s, approached with a weathered logbook. "Ma'am, you signed this for me 3 years ago," he said, his voice cracking. He opened it to a page with her signature, sharp and unmistakable. Emma took it, her fingers brushing the page. "You made it through," she said, her voice warm. The pilot's eyes shone, and he saluted again. The cabin windows were crowded, the air heavy with awe and disbelief. Emma stepped back into the cabin, the helmet under her arm. Sarah forced a smile. "Nice to have a special guest," she said, but her eyes flicked to Emma's boots. John muttered, "Probably just for show." Emma didn't respond, just settled back into 14C, her backpack at her feet. A younger flight attendant approached, holding a silver eagle pin. "This is from the crew. For your service," she said, her voice nervous. The cabin went quiet, all eyes on Emma. She took the pin, pinning it to her backpack without a word. The attendant smiled and hurried back. As the plane prepared for takeoff, 2 F-35s appeared alongside, their wings glinting. Brooks' voice crackled over the radio. "Night Raven, we never got a thank you for last time." Emma pressed the headset she'd been given. "Hold formation, Falcon 1. The response was instant. "Yes, ma'am." The cabin fell silent. Thomas froze, his drink halfway to his mouth. Lauren stared at her phone, her fingers still. Sarah fumbled with a tray, her smile gone. The F-35s escorted the plane as it climbed, and Emma leaned back, her eyes on the jets, her fingers tapping a steady rhythm against the helmet. A passenger in a tailored jacket, his face flushed, approached Emma's row. I didn't know who you were," he stammered. "I'm sorry for what I said." Emma nodded once, her eyes steady but not unkind, then turned back to the window. The cabin felt smaller, charged with awe and shame. The flight to New York felt shorter after that. Emma kept her eyes on the window, watching the F-35s peel away as the city skyline appeared. She'd been 19 when she earned that Eagle patch, flying a mission so classified even her team didn't know the full scope. The sky had been chaos, but she'd brought them home every single one. When the plane landed, Emma stood, the helmet under her arm, her steps steady. Thomas avoided her eyes, his phone pressed to his ear. Lauren typed furiously, her face pale. Sarah stood by the exit, her smile forced. At the gate, a man waited tall, quiet, in a simple suit. David Carter, Emma's husband, a man whose influence was felt in places these passengers couldn't imagine. They walked through the terminal, the helmet under her arm, the eagle pin glinting. A young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Is that the pilot lady?" she whispered. The mother nodded. "That's her," she said, her voice full of respect. Emma caught the girl's eye and smiled, the kind that said she saw her. The fallout came swiftly. Thomas, a mid-level exec at a tech firm, was fired after a video of his comments went viral. Lauren's influencer deal collapsed, her followers dropping by thousands. Sarah was reprimanded, reassigned to short routes. Elizabeth's company distanced itself from her. John's startup lost an investor. Claire's law firm sidelined her from major cases. Emma didn't see any of it. She'd faced worse than their word skies of fire. Decisions where one mistake meant no return. This was just noise. She and David walked through the terminal, their steps in sync, the New York skyline looming outside. The wind tugged at her jacket, but she stood steady, the helmet under her arm. The world had tried to make her small, but she never was. For anyone who'd been judged or silenced, her story was a quiet promise. You're not alone. What do you think? Can someone's appearance ever justify judgment? Have you ever been underestimated because of how you look? Should people like Emma have to prove their worth to strangers? Drop a comment, hit that like button, and subscribe for more stories that challenge the way we see each other.